Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wa salatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. So, welcome back for the latest in our possibly indefinitely to be extended series of reflections on paradigms of leadership. People seem to like the biodata approach to ideas. So with each of these often quite dramatic, always moving human stories of people coming from different kind of times and places and spiritual and fiqhi coordinates in the ummah, we try to hang on that peg a particular idea or concept that inshallah will not be entirely devoid of relevance and interest to ourselves. I want to cover a variety of personages today, but I'll be focusing for most of my presentation on just one. But I'm going to circle in on that revered destination by recalling our coordinates in time and place. Rabi al-Awwal, day of the Mawlid, probably today, but Rabi al-Awwal has other resonances as well. 1441, that's where we are, 11th Rabi al-Awwal, 1441. And we can start with this one, Rashahat Ayn al-Hayat, one of the great classics of our biographical literature by somebody called Maulana Ali Safi, Maulana Ali ibn Hussein Safi, which again is from a Naqshbandi world. And before I finally get to my subject, let's just outline what that world was, not today in Tasmania, but back then in Khurasan, one of the incredible fountainheads really of that inward as well as the outward productivity of this ummah. Khurasan had never been much before Islam touched it. A few ancient Zoroastrian texts, but basically not much. And then suddenly it became a great center for all the hadith scholars and the Hanafi, many Shafi'i jurists, and some of the great tariqas, the Kubrawiyya and the Naqshbandiyya most evidently, and also the Yesaviyya, which we tend not to experience here, but which are important in Central Asia, and the Turkish world from Khwaja Ahmad Yesavi, one of the two great disciples of Sheikh Yusuf Hamadani. So the founder of this tariqah, properly speaking, because everything is subject to the prophetic and external authority of the religion, the founders are all the Holy Prophet, and you can say the founder of all the Sunni madhabs is the Holy Prophet, and his light reflected through the prism of the early generations in a particular way. The madhab of Iraq, the madhab of Medina, and geographically, because of the dispersal patterns of the Sahaba, you have what becomes regional schools. And something similar happens to the inward life of Islam, the masharib, the drinking places, but perhaps even more so. Because even though the fiqh recognizes, something which we often neglect, the importance of local custom as a component of the sharia, the urf and the ada, thereby giving the application of Islamic law and even the content of Islamic law a difference according to time and place. Similarly, the inward life, which deals with the human soul, which is much more part of a place, and the culture of a place then our outward form, that there is a certain regional specificity. However, some tariqas, the Sudanese tariqas that are just really in the Sudan, but the great tariqas, including the tariqas of the Aqtabi Arba'a, we have the four imams and the four Aqtab, and Maulana Baha'uddin Naqshband, Qaddasallahu Sirrahu, certainly one of the four. And that tariqa really is kind of everywhere in the ummah. Hasn't really touched Morocco much, although there's Naqshbandis in Morocco, but there's lots of Naqshbandis in Indonesia and all over Central Asia. It's the tariqa, default tariqa in Central Asia, East Africa, certainly in Turkey, certainly in Bosnia. Our Sheikh from Cambridge left this morning to go to tend to his father. We need to pray for Sheikh Ziyad's father because he's having quite serious heart surgery tomorrow, and that's a Naqshbandi lineage everywhere in the Ummah, the Naqshbandiyya. So very specific to Bukhara in its origin, but somehow manages to become a part of the universalism of Islam. So Khwaja Baha'u'ddin Naqshband dies 1389, one of the most transformative figures of the Ummah, from the village of Qasr-e Arifan, the palace of the knowers of God, as the village is still called, which is half an hour's drive outside Bukhara, and still an amazing place, a place of wonders. Whatever your relationship to the tariqah or to tasawwuf might be, is still really beautiful. Huge area, hundreds of acres of lakes and mulberry trees, and there's an old madrasa there, and there's an old observatory where they'd work out the times of the prayers, Misafir Khane, a place for travellers, several mosques, and it's a place where people in Bukhara, which is a kind of Sovietized urban space, unfortunately, tend to go the weekend just in order to enjoy the serenity of this place. And that's where he's buried. And when you go to these Khwajagan, the great masters of Naqshbandi line in Central Asia, to their tombs, you see, they're really simple. Remember, this is Sunni Tarash, Sunnifying Tariqah, and the graves are all basically open to the sky and to the rain. They have a kind of marble enclosure around them, but the tombs themselves really simple. And you remember the kind of austerity that these people represent. So if we can ever visit Uzbekistan, which is, you can see Imam Bukhari and Imam Tirmidhi, it's everybody is there. Imam Maturidi, Imam Marghinani, it's an incredible place. Yeah, it's certainly worth visiting the Mazar of Khwaja Baha'u'ddin Naqshband. And his story is one of those almost demoralizingly austere stories of Sufi transformation. Many teachers, including Amir Kulal, who saw him as a young man with promise, and they got him to take the hard road to sanctity. So for 7 years he was directed to be a road mender, in all his biographers. In other words, the roads were, as you can imagine, pretty dreadful, even worse than they are, thanks to the Highways Agency, sort of 10 years after the recession and the cuts, nothing but potholes. So one of the things medieval Sufis liked to do was to go out and kind of just fix public utilities, just drag some rubble and put them in potholes. So he did this for 7 years, and then he was directed to look after animals for 7 years. Any book on animal rights in Islam is going to love the stories of Khwaja Baha'u'ddin Naqshband. And you can imagine medieval cities got lots of sick animals around and kind of neglected creatures that people have just chucked out, and mangy dogs and so forth. So as part of their ego-surpassing techniques, they would go out to serve the street animals. So let me just read his own words as documented in a later hagiography. In the beginning of my travel on this way, I met a lover of Allah, and he told me, "It seems as if you are one of us." I told him, "I hope to be a friend to you." One time he asked me, "How do you treat yourself?" Nafs. I said to him, "If I find something, I thank Allah, and if not, I am patient, sabir." He smiled and said, "That is easy. The way for you is to burden your ego and to test it. If it loses food for 1 week, you must be able to keep it from disobeying you." I was very happy with his answer, and I asked his support. He ordered me to help the needy and to serve the weak and to motivate the heart of the broken-hearted. He ordered me to keep humbleness and humility and tolerance. I kept his orders, and I spent many days of my life in that manner. Then he ordered me to take care of animals, to cure their sicknesses, to clean their wounds, and to assist them in finding their provision. I kept on that way until I reached the state that if I saw an animal in the street, I would stop and make way for it. Then he ordered me to look after the neighborhood dogs with truthfulness and humility and to ask them for support. He told me, "Because of your service to one of them, you will reach great happiness." I took that order in the hope that I would find one dog, and through service to that dog, I would find that happiness. One day, I was in the company of one of them, and I felt a great state of happiness overcome me. I began crying in front of him until he fell on his back and raised his paws in the air. I heard a very sad voice or sound emanating from the dog, and so I raised my hands in dua and began to say Ameen after the dog's kind of groaning. It was a sick dog, until the dog became silent. What then opened for me was a vision which brought me to a state in which I felt that I was part of every human being and part of every creation on this earth. So he has his fath, his mystical experience beyond description. This is a characteristically Naqshbandi story. Okay, they're very Sharia compliant, but he's making Ameen to the dua of a kind of stray dog in the streets of Bukhara. And the dog is going, and he's Ameen, Ameen, everybody's this crazy dervish. Just really lock him up. And that's really characteristic of the way that they see things. Service, khidmat is absolutely essential. In this case, service to these kind of pie dogs in the street that no one would give a second glance to normally, but usually kick out of the way. So a difficult path, but sa'adat is the word that's used, great happiness. When the ego goes, really goes, rather than just feels proud of itself for allegedly not being there. When it really isn't there, there is a liberation and a tajreed and this strange circumstance of saying Ameen to the dua of a dog. And that's how he is launched and becomes Khwaja Baha'u'ddin Naqshband, with this amazing place outside Bukhara. But again, I'm not going to focus on him during this lecture, but on the disciple of his disciple. Alauddin Bukhari is one of his great murids, who hands on this light to Maulana Yaqub Sharqi, who hands it on to Khwaja Ubaidullah Ahrar, sometimes called Ubaidullah Tashqandi, who is, in Uzbekistan, they overdose on these Khwajagan. They're everywhere, and the places are really full of people, and you get people from India, Turkey, the Caucasus visiting them. They're really busy. And Khwaja Abdul Khaliq Khujdavani, who establishes the 8 principles on which the tariqah is later based, who's a predecessor of Shah Baha'u'ddin Naqshband, is in the town of Khujdavan, and Amir Kulal, Rami Tani, Baba Samasi, they're all there and surrounded by rose gardens, and they're very serene, nice places. Uzbekistan is nice. But Khwaja Ubaidullah Ahrar is kind of a special case. He's buried in what used to be a village just outside Samarkand, which is itself this kind of miracle city, despite the Sovietization. You can see the clash between the sacred and the secular, maybe more clearly in Samarkand than in any other city on the earth, because you've got the Soviet blocks, grey concrete, everywhere, rational, efficient, inhuman. And then at the centre of town, you've got this Registan Square. Has anybody been to Registan Square? Samarkand, yeah. Which is like this miracle. These 3 immense madrasas, sky blue, covered in the world's finest ceramics, facing each other around this square. It's like, say, the 3 greatest cathedrals in Christendom kind of next to each other, and it's kind of aesthetic overload. And you can see the tourists kind of looking at this and just not saying anything, because it's just such a staggeringly serene, brilliant statement of the greatness of our civilization. So there's that, and one of the madrasas is open again. I remember on my first visit, it was still the Museum of Atheism. Oh, depressing. So all these little Uzbek school children would be taken and shown these kind of waxworks of how the mullahs would deceive the people and take their money. That's gone now, alhamdulillah. Atheism turned out not to be quite as dialectically inevitable as Marx and Lenin thought. And there's madrasa students back then in one of the, I think it's the Tilekari madrasa, one of the three, and it's restored to something of its intended function. But yeah, you shouldn't die without seeing Registan Square. It's one of the great sights on earth. So Khwaja Ubaidullah Ahrar is buried near his house, his khanaqah, his dervish retreat in Kashgir, a suburb of Samarkand. And again, it's kind of simple. There's no sky blue dome or anything, just kind of this square of a stone retaining wall and then a simple tombstone and a million Uzbeks and others there receiving the blessings. But again, characteristic Naqshbandi, and we'll see this as we progress through his life, although I don't mainly want to do biodata, but to kind of go to the Rashahat and recite the way Sheikh Abdal used to do some of his words and incidents in his life. But he started off inconceivably poor and put through the sort of refiner's fire of deliberate poverty for years and years as part of the process of overcoming his ego. But later in his life, he becomes one of the richest men in the world, at least ostensibly, because everybody wants his dua, and all of the landowners and the emirs are giving him huge areas of land. So that according to some of the Waqf documents, and the Russians, when they take over and sort of regularize their Central Asian colonies in the 1870s, sort of make a register of this, maybe 3,200 villages and their lands and estates are his Waqf. And somebody called Joanne Gross, who's an American expert on Central Asia and the Naqshbandis, has written on the Waqfiyas, which are still there in the University Library in Tashkent, and indicate the enormous amount of stuff that he ostensibly owned. Finally eliminated, nationalized by the Soviets, of course, in the 1920s, so they could put up these grey tower blocks and the collective farms where millions of people died. Not a great ending to that story, but for 5 centuries, Central Asia was really economically dominated by these awqaf, which were used to support sacred knowledge, the madrasas, to build mosques, to do things like to build and maintain bridges, and also to establish the khanaqahs, the lodges of Khwaja Ubaidullah Ahrar's Naqshbandi tariqah, particularly to the north. Just call to mind, if you can, the geography of where we are. The Eurasian landmass, right in the middle of it is what we now call Uzbekistan, although that's not really a real historical designation. It's part of what used to be Khorasan and then became Turkestan. But is so ethnically mixed. People of Samarkand still basically speak Farsi, they don't speak Uzbek, unless there's a policeman around, but basically it's Farsi speaking. And this Turkestan, if you were looking at it from the rest of the Ummah, or from China, which it was closely connected to, or Mongolia, where the Mongols came from, or from Western Europe, Marco Polo goes through, it's the center of everything. But what is there to the north? To the south there's Persia and India and amazing things. To the east there's China, to the west there's the Silk Road. To the north, has anybody seen Antonio Banderas in that film about Ibn Fadlan, the 13th Warrior? It's a kind of stupid Michael Crichton horror film, but it's based on the life of Ibn Fadlan, who is this 10th century Baghdad traveller who decided to go north. What happens if you go north from the Ummah at that time? Not China, India, Europe, Africa, but north. Well, what happens north of Tashkent, Samarkand, Bukhara is, of course, enormous steppe land, flat, undulating grass, like the American prairies that seems to go on forever, full of wild, naked men with sort of feathers through their bald heads who are likely to kidnap you and take you into eternal exile. Difficult nomadic warrior peoples. Later you get the Kipchaks and the Cossacks and people coming from that world on tough steppe ponies. The weather is excruciatingly awful because you're dealing with the center of the landmass. So in the summer, it's shockingly hot. In the winter, even in Uzbekistan, average temperatures in Samarkand in January, February, round about minus 30 centigrade. It's kind of a deep freeze. And remember, these people who are cleaning the roads and looking after the street animals are living in that. But to the north of it, you've got Siberia. Let's go to India instead. If you were sort of somebody who wanted to do traveling in that part of the world, India sounds nice. So not many people went up there. And the Islamizing of those regions, which was a big fact of our history, comes about partly because the Mongols, who don't mind being cold and sitting on ponies for 3 months and drinking horse milk, and they conquer those areas. And after the death of Genghis Khan, you have the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire, and the Altun Ordu, the Golden Horde, takes over much of what's now Ukraine, the Russian steppe, the North Caucasus, and Western Siberia. And as Genghis Khan's descendants Islamize, so the Mongols become the Mongols become the Mughals in India, and then the Golden Horde also become an Islamic polity. You get significant Muslim populations established right up there, which is still the case. In northern Russia you can find Muslim communities. There was a Khanate of Siberia, before Ivan the Terrible crashed through. It's a kind of amputated bit of the Ummah. But back in this period, up there to the north, problematic. If you've seen the 13th Warrior, you'll see that it's Omar Sharif who's kind of on a horse, and Antonio Banderas, and they're going to the north because of some crazy story about Viking zombies that they've been prophetically chosen to go and combat. It's not the real Ibn Fadlan. But anyway, they're riding north, and you get Vikings who are kind of not the kind of people you'd like to bump into on a dark night. And then you've got these sort of proto-Cossacks, and it's hard, and not a tree in sight. So nobody really went up there, except the Naqshbandiya, because one of the usages of the awqaf of Khwaja Ubaidullah Ahrar was specifically to try and get the hardier type of murid to settle to the north. Rather, as the Cossacks, who are a kind of quasi-church organization, were used by the Russians several centuries later to colonize the same territories, same sort of principle. So that was one of the uses of this enormous amount of wealth that came into his coffers, which he himself didn't touch because of this Naqshbandi tradition of not accepting the futur gifts to the dervishes, but still a reminder of how economically and da'wah-wise significant these movements were. So let's just get stuck into this nice text, much nicer than my own words. What have we got here? Yeah, something. Okay, this is just a reminder about the Sharia compliance of these people. Let's start with that thought. And this is Maulana Ali Safi himself writing. Among the preachers whose khutbahs I have greatly enjoyed, I must mention Maulana Shamsuddin. When Maulana Shamsuddin was delivering a khutbah, he could not hold back his tears, and he wept convulsively. In order to understand the reason for his weeping, I asked and listened with careful attention. He said, Mirza Shahrukh, one of the great Mongol rulers, is known as the Emperor of the Muslims. According to what I've heard, one of his companions was called to account for claiming to have had relations with one of his concubines, and he was killed at Mirza's command by being thrown down from the minaret. This penalty has no connection with the rule of the sacred law. The first question is whether or not the alleged crime is actually proved. Even if it is proved, this is not its penalty. In the sacred law, there is no penalty in the form of execution by being thrown down from the minaret. If it's not proved, it means the man is definitely innocent. And how can this injustice to a Muslim be explained? From every point of view, Mirza's every action is inconsistent with the sacred law. So this is in his khutbah, and he's got a Mongol ruler breathing down his throat, but is not hesitating to point out that the sacred law is here being violated. I understood that the Maulana was weeping for this reason. In those so attached to the religion, nothing is felt more acutely than anguished concern for the sacred law and the pain caused by disrespect for the sacred law. Here's another one, another khutbah story. Maulana Shihabuddin Sayarami was the teacher of the Sheikh Zainuddin Khafi and the Venerable Maulana Yaqub Charkhi, who is Khwaja Ubaidullah's own sheikh. When he came to Samarkand, he was requested to deliver a khutbah. The Venerable Maulana Muhammad Attar Samarkandi, one of the great masters of wisdom, a Khwajagan, was also there at the time. Maulana Shihabuddin accepted the invitation, and before mounting the pulpit, the minbar, he bowed down and kissed the lowest step on its staircase. On seeing this sight, Maulana Muhammad Attar stood up at once, left the congregation, and went out of the mosque. When Maulana Shihabuddin observed this situation, he descended from the minbar without starting his khutbah and followed after Maulana Muhammad Attar. He caught up with him and asked, "What impropriety did I commit so that you left my sermon without waiting for me to say a word?" And he received this answer: "We are constantly striving to ensure that no bid'ah remains among the people. But what about you? From where did you acquire the bid'ah of kissing the lowest step while mounting the minbar? In what ayah and what hadith did you see this prescribed? Which of the great imams did this? If such a practice emerges from people of knowledge like you, how shall we be able ever to attend a khutbah?" So these stories are also part of this. This is not some kind of dervish latitudinarian. This is Sunni Tarash, very Sunnifying, emphatic pro-Sharia Islam. Now, maybe one of the interesting paradoxes of our history is this phenomenon that academics and historians are increasingly discussing called the Timurid Renaissance. And one groans and thinks, oh dear, here's an attempt by somebody or other to prove that Islam was kind of on the track that the West has followed. And so Renaissance, what a wonderful thing it was in Europe. So the Muslims have done it, so it's kind of an apologetic thing. But nonetheless, the descendants of Timur in Herat, in the 14th, 15th centuries, did create a civilization that was quite extraordinarily productive and brilliant. And what we need to reflect on is the fact that it was also absolutely under the sign of Naqshbandi Sufism. So this tariqah that says, I'm not going to hear your khutbah if you're kissing the step of the minbar because that's a bid'ah, is also producing the miracle of Herat. Even today in Herat you can see ruins of buildings that are kind of miracles. You know, the lapis lazuli that they have in Afghanistan, so there's amazing sky blue tiles and the calligraphy, and it's like seeing calligraphy in heaven. Those buildings are incomparable. Now, the Timurid dynasty is founded by Timur, who is buried in Uzbekistan. Gur Amir, one of the great sites of Samarkand, huge dome. And underneath it there is his grave under the biggest piece of jade that's ever been discovered anywhere in the world, and it's still there. Kind of Chinese Mongol idea that jade preserves from corruption, thought to be from heaven. It's still there, and it's a very atmospheric place, even when you remember that the guy probably killed millions of people and piled up the skulls of Muslims in great pyramids and was one of the bad Mongols, really. From the Baralas tribe, one of the remnants of Genghis Khan's original bloodletting horde, he rules a lot of India, Central Asia. His big cities, though, were kind of in Central Asia: Samarkand, Balkh, Herat. Now, one of the biggest questions in all of Islamic history is how these sort of axe murderers who come from these shamanistic, Buddhistic regions of Mongolia and build these mountains of skulls and kill half the population of Hungary, and it's kind of a Holocaust, but 10 times worse. When they took the city of Balkh, which was a city of 100,000 people, only 40 people who hid are supposed to have survived, and much of Central Asia is still depopulated, they say, because of that. Everybody died. How is it that those people kind of, sort of, I don't know, the Mordor of the age, some kind of completely dark negativity, that they became Muslim and end up producing, not just the wonders of India, the Taj Mahal, blah, blah, but also in Afghanistan, in Herat, the Timurid Renaissance. It's quite a transformation. And it's worth reading around that. The conversion of the Mongols to Islam was one of the big significant strategic facts of history. Everybody in Europe was praying for them to become Catholics. Some of them did. It was kind of touch and go, because the early Mongols had more or less prohibited the practice of Islam, and there are now Buddhist temples all over Iran, and the Khalifa had been trampled to death 1258, and it was it seemed to be the end of the world. The first Mongol ruler to convert was Ghazan Khan, who was brought up by a Chinese Buddhist monk, but converts through processes that you can read about in Thomas Arnold's book, The Preaching of Islam. There's a whole chapter on the conversion of the Mongols, which uses something called the Taj al-Tawarikh of Rashid ad-Din, which is one of the big medieval Persian history books. And you can read about the role of the Sufis, particularly the Kubrawi Tariqa, Saifuddin Yahya Bakharzi in particular, and the Naqshbandi Tariqa in converting them. And there's a lesson for us in that, because 1258, Mongols sack Baghdad. Maybe they even used the Mongol word for shock and awe. And then the Americans do it, but what is the different response of the Ummah? Back then, not shouting and terrorism and suicide bombing and stabbing the Mongol soldier in the market in Baghdad, even though the adhan was prohibited and halal slaughter carried the death sentence, and Islam was kind of prescribed. But instead, dhikr, patience, and a determination not just to survive and be angry, but to convert the Mongols. In other words, to see them as human beings who need something better. So pity instead of anger. And as a result, you have lots of extraordinary stories about the patience of some of the great Sufi sheikhs, Maulana Rashid ad-Din in Samarkand, summoned to the court of one of the pagan khans, and his entourage, the Mongols, said, we want to have a laugh, so please show us how you Persians pray. So he prays 2 rakas, and then one of them comes over to him, grabs his head and bangs it on the floor, in the hope of making him angry, so he'll say something that gets him put to death. And then Amir says, you Persians, look at you down there, you're like dogs. And he just says, but for Islam, we would be worse than dogs. And he's allowed to go, and through those moments of the extraordinary dignity of these people, you find that eventually people like Ghazan and also Uljaitul becomes first a Christian because his mother is a Nestorian princess, and then he becomes Muslim. So he's baptized as Nicholas. Great church bells all over Europe. Half the Ummah of Islam is ruled by King Nicholas now, and they think the Messiah is going to come. But he ends up becoming Muslim because of the spiritual quality of these people. So, a vain thought, if our radical friends in Baghdad and Mosul, instead of doing what they chose to do, with all of that anger, had done what the Naqshbandis and others had done 6 centuries before, well, who knows, maybe Paul Wolfowitz would be Mahmoud or something, and the world would look very different. But this is the power of monotheism, that even those monster Mongol barbarians, they have souls too, and they can be transformed. So there's a lesson for us in that, and it's worth reading about these people. So the Timurids, by this time, they've been Muslim for a century, and they create this incredible little jewel in the crown of Islamic civilization. One of the great Persian painters, Kamaluddin Behzad, you can see his works at the British Library. Extraordinary refinement is from there. The Timurid ruler of Herat, Ulugh Beg, builds about the most famous observatory in the Islamic world, or maybe anywhere before the invention of Galileo and lenses. This is done through naked eye observation, but you can still see it. I went there in Samarkand with extraordinary ways of calculating the elevation trajectory of the travelling stars. Great works of architecture, the Shahi Zinda in Samarkand, possibly the world's most beautiful cemetery. Staggering place. The mausoleum of Khwaja Ahmed Yasavi, which is in Turkestan, which is now in Kazakhstan. Okay, one of those places full of snow and scary men on horseback, but they're going up there, and he really becomes the patron saint of what is now Kazakhstan, and a wonderfully beautiful building. So Herat becomes this huge centre, and the Sultan Hossein Baykara, it's again, there's no time to go through his story, but it's a very dramatic story because he's kind of exiled and in hiding for 10 years, and then comes to power, capturing Herat. He's Timur's great-grandson. And he's very educated. We have his autobiography indicating his Naqshbandi sympathies. And one of the things that we find in Timurid Herat is a great conviviality between Sunni and Shi'i, which was not the case in some parts of Iran, where there were places like Sabzavar, Yazd, Kerman, where there was very strong disputatiousness. But the Timurids didn't appreciate this at all. And so you have in Sultan Hussein Baykara's accounts of the Ahl al-Bayt, a kind of what the Arabs used to call, before the current ruptures, Tashayyu' Hasan. In other words, a good sympathy with Ahl al-Bayt and Karbala and Imam Hussein, rather than the kind of extremism. And he arranged these extraordinary festivals, street festivals. So one modern Orientalist calls it the Florence of the East. You know how the Italians love to have these street festivals with flags and knights on horseback and so forth. It was very much a fluorescent kind of place. Abdurrahman Jami is there. Now, if you're a madrasa student, you'll think, it's his commentary on Ibn al-Hajib. It's the most dull Arabic book ever. Mullah Jami in Turkey now means excruciating Arabic syntax. But that's just one of his books. He's also the author of the Haft Aurang, Seven Thrones, this incredible series of stories, Joseph and Zuleikha, Salaman and Absal, Layla and Majnun, in the most exquisite book-length Persian couplets. And they're some of the classics of our civilization. But Mullah Abdurrahman Jami also, Naqshbandi. Last year I was in Tartu in Estonia, where they happen to have in their little university library one of the world's great copies of the Haft Aurang, which was a gift from a 18th century Persian king to the Tsarist ambassador, so somehow it survived Hitler and Stalin and the Luftwaffe, and it's there. Staggeringly beautiful thing, a jewel, and one of the monuments of our civilization. And you see the calligraphy, the binding, the illumination, everything perfect, and it's from a Naqshbandi culture. So don't think that this emphasis on poverty, self-naughting, Sharia compliance means you can't have one of the world's great civilizations. The beauty of Timurid Herat. No, it's not like that. It's not like the desert against the city, austerity against beauty. It's much more sophisticated than that. So Abdurrahman Jami dies 1492. with his Haft Aurang and his books on irrigation and his grammar book and his interest in astronomy, mathematics, the Nafahat al-Uns, which is one of the big texts which we have on Naqshbandi biography, basically focusing on 15th century Naqshbandis, Nafahat al-Uns, which means something, the breathings or the exhalations of intimacy. Very nice text. Ali Shir Nava'i, another of the jewels in the crown of the Timurid Renaissance, who becomes kind of a senior minister at the Timurid court and possibly the greatest of all early Turkic poets. They used a language called Chagatai. As the Mongols switched over about a century from Mongolian to a kind of Turkic, this Chagatai Turkish, which isn't spoken any longer, includes a lot of Arabic and Persian words. It's quite archaic. But the main street in Tashkent now is named after him. And again, a great enthusiast for the Naqshbandis. He built 17 mosques just in Herat. His Munajat, his book on the benefits of old age, which he writes when he's old, and also a list of biographical sort of notes on the great Naqshbandi saints. Kamaluddin Hussain Va'iz Kashefi, author of a number of great Persian texts, including the Anvari Sohaili, which was a set text for British India Office officials in the 18th century when they wanted to deal with the Indian elite. So that meant you had to know your Persian literature. So the first printed edition was in Baldock, if you can imagine. If you've been to Baldock in Hertfordshire, they did several editions there. But also the Rawdat al-Shuhada, which of course has a little version which we recite here in Cambridge, which is a commemoration of the sufferings of the Ahl al-Bayt. Remember this interesting thing, that this is a Naqshbandi city, and you think the Naqshbandis, their silsila is the only one that goes back through Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. And yet they're producing this civilization that is so open to the Ahl al-Bayt and produces the Rawdat al-Shuhada, which even amongst the Shia is the preferred recital for Muharram. They do it in villages in Iran. It's in 10 chapters. One chapter is recited on each of the first 10 days of Muharram. He's a Naqshbandi, and the 12 of Shia love it. They do it in Lucknow and places in India as well, which is interesting in terms of contemporary ideas of these polarities. It's not either or, it can be both. And so the author of this book, Maulana Ali Safi, is the son of Kashifi, who produces the Rawdat al-Shuhada, so very much in the Naqshbandi tradition. So we have the Naqshbandis doing this rather extraordinary thing of being instrumental in converting the mass murdering tribes to Islam and ushering in, in a certain way, the second half of Islamic history, when things become very sort of Persianate and Turkic, and the Mongols are not like the earlier dynasties, and the greatness of the Golden Horde, the Crimea, the Ottomans, in a sense, come out of this. And in the midst of this sort of Naqshbandi revival, not just of the spirit, but of the civilization, arts, crafts, poetry, etc., of Islam, you have Khwaja Ubaidullah Ahrar, who is born in 1403 in what was then called Shesh, which is now Tashkent, which has become the Uzbek capital. In earlier times, if you were Sheshi, some of the great Hanafi fuqaha were Sheshi, it meant you were from Tashkent. If you look at the map, you can see this is kind of further out, further away from the Middle East than Bukhara and Samarkand. It's not terribly, it's like an hour's drive from the Kazakh border. So up there you've got the wild men and the treeless steppes and the snakes. But Tashkent, Shash becomes really a major outpost of Maturidi Hanafi and then Naqshbandi civilization. So Khwaja Ubaidullah Ahrar is from there. And we learn all kinds of things about his childhood, and we're so used to Muslim hagiographies that say, oh, he memorized the Quran at the age of 5, and he was stunned all of his teachers in hadith by the age of 7, and etc., etc. But it seems he was a bit of a non-academic child, and his parents kind of despaired sending him to madrasa, and he didn't really get into it. And we have the account in this sort of eyewitness account of how he recalled his childhood, if I can find where we start from. This is what he himself said. I used to go to and from school. My heart was always with Allah, and I assumed that everyone else was just like me. One cold winter day, while passing through the countryside, my foot sank into the mud. While trying to set it free, I also let the hem of my coat get stuck. A state of ghaflat, heedlessness, overcame me at that moment. Being so caught up in this business, he's got his boot stuck, I was distracted from remembering Allah. A young villager was busy ploughing nearby, and I scolded myself, saying, look, even in such agonizing labor, that young man is thinking of his Maker. How can you forget him just because of a little effort to retrieve your foot from the mire? Sobbing and blubbering, I burst into tears. At that stage, I still supposed that everyone was the same as myself, and I assumed that it was normal, obvious to remember Allah at every moment. Until I reached the age of puberty, I could not understand that there were people heedless of Allah. I thought that Allah had created everyone to be aware of himself. In fact, as I later came to realize, not to be heedless of Allah can be a divine favor, peculiar to only a few of his servants. Or it is a divine favor, peculiar to only a few of his servants. It can only be obtained through spiritual exercise and struggle with the lower self, though it's a property that few seem able to acquire, even by those means. According to the Khwaja's nephew, Khwaja Ishaq, while I and the other children were playing games, we would try to get the venerable Khwaja, Ubaidullah, to join us, but we could not persuade him, in spite of our most persistent efforts. He would stand in a corner, happy, as if playing by himself, and he would remain in his own special state. Yep. And then we have some information about how he was when he became a little older. The Venerable Khwaja himself relates, in a dream, during the early stage of my spiritual development, I saw the Venerable Khwaja Baha'u'ddin Naqshband. He exerted such power of dispensation on my inner being that no strength was left in my legs. Then he suddenly turned and started walking away. Making my utmost effort, I ran after him and caught up with him. He turned back and said, "May you be blessed." Sometime later, I also saw the Venerable Khwaja Muhammad Parsa in a dream. He tried to affect me with his power of dispensation, but he could not succeed. The Venerable Khwaja again relates this. In the palace of Ulugh Bey Mirza, remember he's the one who's built this amazing observatory, there was an officer charged with the enforcement of penalties. He used to administer the penalty of flogging. The officer sent word to Tashkent, announcing that the sons of the sheikhs were to assemble in a gathering and that he wished to see them. We duly gathered together, 17 young men, of whom I was the youngest. Each time that officer shook someone's hand, the person was seen to enter a state of rapture. When my turn came, I decided to resist that state if it started to overtake me too, and I was successful in my resistance. The officer was very pleased with my resistance. He brought me to the front and heaped all kinds of favors upon me. For my part, I wondered how someone could be endowed with such inner strength and yet be engaged in political and police administration in the service of the Bey. I was utterly baffled by this, but he read my thoughts and he said, "I was a pupil of the Venerable Khwaja Hassan Attar. I spent a long time at his side, and I strove to enrich my inner being, but success eluded me. When I expressed my pain to the Venerable Khwaja, he instructed me to work at the Sultan's command, and to attend once again to my inner being by secretly helping the oppressed. He also wrote a letter to those concerned, declaring me free to follow my own guidance. With the help of the shock I received from this action, and from realizing that the Venerable Khwaja expected me to succeed, I finally attained my goal through performing the duty that he had imposed upon me. Since I patiently endured the agony I suffered, whenever I could not help the Muslims in trouble, the poor and the unfortunate, those whose rights were being violated, I was able to obtain the degree you now witness. So that's another kind of tribulation that leads to an unexpected sort of high spiritual state. The Khwaja is telling him, go and work as a policeman for the government, secretly try to help the poor and the oppressed. And the suffering that you'll experience whenever you're not successful in that will be an overcoming of your ego, and you'll achieve this enlightenment as a result of that. I was in the early stage of my career. My mother owned a farm. She sent me a quantity of wheat, which was brought by me by a nomadic Turk, which means basically one of these kind of half shamanistic rough guys from the north. Turk is basically a rude word in this culture. While I was busy storing the wheat, that Turk went off with his sacks. It was unclear where he had gone and which road he had taken. At that moment, a dreadfully disturbing question took root inside me. Why had I put myself at fault by failing to seek spiritual grace from this simple fellow? It seemed that I had missed an opportunity that was important. Leaving the wheat unattended, I set out after that Turk. I caught up with him halfway along the city road, and I begged, "Take notice of me. Cast a caring glance on my condition. Perhaps Allah will put me in contact with the blessing of your spiritual influence, and I thus may be protected and my knotty problems may be solved." The man looked at me with astonishment, and he said, "Presumably you're practicing the teaching of the Turkish sheikhs. Whomever you see, assume that he is Khidr. Assume that every night is the Laylatul Qadr. As for myself, I'm a Turk who lives in the desert, and I hardly know how to wash my face correctly. How can the things you seek exist in me?" That Turk was deeply affected by my plea, and so much that he raised his hands and offered a dua on my behalf. Through the blessed grace of that supplication, I experienced revelations and disclosures within my inner being. No one knows what prayer of supplication Allah will accept and under what conditions. That is a secret. This again, characteristically Naqshbandi teaching, that you assume the best of everybody. Such and such a person may be al-Khidr. He may be the kind of smelly guy who's bringing you wheat on his bullock cart, but he may be the one who can help you to overcome ego and reconnect with ruh. During my childhood, the power of imagination at my disposal was beyond my understanding, to the point where I could not even conceive of going outside the house on my own. Then one night I experienced a state in which involuntarily I felt compelled to visit the tomb of the venerable Sheikh Abu Bakr Sheshi. I jumped up and left the house. I went to the tomb. I sat facing the tomb of the venerable Sheikh. No trace of fear affected me. I stayed like that for an hour. From there, I moved over to the tomb of Sheikh Khwaja Tahur. I was still unafraid. I've also visited the other tombs. At none of them did I feel afraid. Despite my young age and my wild imagination, in the shade of the spirituality of the saints, not one atom of fear was inspired in me by those awesome tombs in the darkness of night. When this state of mind began to captivate me, I made a nightly habit of wandering around all the tombs of Tashkent. The tombs were situated quite far from one another, but I used to visit them all in one night. At that time, I had just set foot in the age of puberty. The people of my household soon became worried about these nightly wanderings of mine, so they set my foster brother on my tail and tried to find out whether or not I was doing something bad. One night, when I was next to the tomb of Sheikh Khwaja Tahur, along came my foster brother. Soon as he reached my side, he laid his hand on mine and began to shudder. He said that he could see strange and mysterious things. I sent him home. When he got there, he told my relatives, "You need not be suspicious of him any longer. You must realize that he has fallen into a different state from ours. In the dark night, at the head of tombs into which 10 men could not be inserted at the same time, he stays all alone until morning." After learning this, the people of the household understood that I had been endowed with a spiritual state of divine origin, and they wiped their bad suspicions from their minds. One other night, I was sitting at the tomb of Sheikh Zainuddin. The tomb was on the outskirts of the city and in a lonely spot. There was a madman in Tashkent, a fellow with a huge body like a statue, and he had killed someone in the city in recent days. People were afraid of him, and they kept their distance from any place where he had been seen. Suddenly, while I was at the head of the tomb, he appeared and screamed, "Get up! Get out of here! Go away!" I gave him no response and did not interrupt my vigil. The man went on shouting, but I still took no notice. He sprang forward, plucked some dry herbs from the head of the tomb and made them into a bouquet. Then he opened the lantern burning at the head of the tomb and ignited the herbs. His purpose was to set the burning herbs on top of my head. As he was approaching me in order to do this, a sudden gust of wind extinguished the flaming herbs in his hand. The madman was utterly enraged. This time he launched a verbal tirade, and this state of affairs continued until the morning. Suddenly, just as the day was dawning, he disappeared like a bat that has seen the light. He had gone to Tashkent, and there in the early morning hour he turned the market upside down. He also killed a man. The people ganged together and beat him to death with sticks. As the Venerable Khwaja himself relates, people tell of certain things having appeared to them from the tombs. Nothing of the kind had ever shown itself to me. So he was there, but in a state of sobriety. While the Venerable Khwaja Abdul Khaliq Ujdavani and his affiliates were strolling through the market quarter and the bazaar, the noise and hubbub of the people and the merchants reached their ears as the sound of remembrance, dhikr. They never heard anything other than the remembrance. In the early stage of my own development, the remembrance had become so predominant and preponderant for me that I heard the remembrance in every sound and whisper of the wind. One day, a rich man from Samarkand held a wedding feast. At the invitation of a friend, I had gone to a spot near the site of the feast. All the shouting and calling of the wedding guests, as well as all the sounds of music, came to my ears like the dhikr, like the remembrance. I neither heard nor listened to anything else. At that time, I was 18 years of age. Then it moves on to his adult life. I was in Herat at the time of Mirza Shahrukh, that's the prince. As far as money was concerned, I did not have a bean. Okay, this is Mukhtar's slightly idiomatic translation. The turban on my head was in tatters. As soon as I knotted one part of it, the rest would come undone and dangle loose. One day, as I was passing through the marketplace, a beggar asked me for something. I had no money to give him, so I approached a cook, removed the turban from my head and said, "This turban is old, but it is clean. It could be used for drying and wiping when you are washing the pots and pans. Take it and give this poor beggar a dish of food." After giving the beggar enough to satisfy his hunger, the cook set the turban before me with great politeness, but I did not accept it, and I went on my way. The Venerable Khwaja relates, "I worked in the service of many different people, but I had nothing, not even a horse or a donkey to call my own. I changed my kaftan once a year because its cotton padding wore out. Every 3 years I managed to get by with one fur coat and one jacket. One winter season, together with Maulana Musafir, I was sitting in a room with a view of the street. The floor of the room was below the street level. Rain, water and mud leaked into our room. In the mornings, we used to go and perform the ritual prayer in the congregational mosques. My clothes and my undergarments were so flimsy that half of my body never got warm. In all the time I spent away from home, I could never easily obtain a couple of jugs of warm water for my ritual ablution. When I needed to restore my ritual purity, I was sometimes leave my sheikh's company and go all the way into town. I remember this is probably a place that's completely frozen. The thought occurred to me, if only the venerable sheikh would consider letting the spiritual paupers, the fuqara darwishan, have a drop of warm water so that they could perform their ablutions here in the icy winter. Alas, that favour was never granted. Here we are, ready to make proper use of a cubicle, a lamplight, water, steam bath and a bite to eat, yet we're all caught up in wrangling, unaware of the priceless opportunity we are missing. In the time of Mirza Shahrukh, there was a rich man, the chief of the moneylenders, who showed great respect for the path of the Khwajagan. In particular, he recognized the special grace of the venerable Khwaja Muhammad Parsa. I would not eat at the table of anyone in the city, and I refused all the invitations of this notable individual. Ramadan finally arrived. The man came to me and said, "During this Ramadan, you will break your fast every evening at my place." I asked to be excused. He insisted and insisted. When I repeated my request to be excused, he said, "If you do not break fast every evening at my place, let my wife be divorced with a triple repudiation." Reluctantly, I was thus obliged to act in accordance with the man's insistent demand. I experienced much help and positive interest from this man. In those times, I did not have the means to reciprocate. I did have the means later on, but the man had died by that time. I was at least in a position to give his son 10,000 dinars, as well as providing him with some other services. Throughout his entire life, the Venerable Khwaja Ubaidullah Tashkandi never once accepted a present from anyone. One of the great masters stitched a kaftan for him out of white lamb's wool with his own hand and sent it to him. He took every care to ensure that the present was made of lawful material. When the Venerable Khwaja saw it, he said, "This kaftan is permissible to wear because the scent of rectitude and lawfulness drifts from it. Not once in my whole life, however, have I accepted a gift from anyone. Convey our apology to the Venerable Master and present this to him as our gift this time." So lots of stories about Sharia scrupulousness. When you accept a gift, you can never be entirely sure of its origin. At the age of 24, he moved to Herat, where he stayed for 5 years, establishing fellowship with the Sufi sheikhs. Then at the age of 29, he returned to his native land. After that, in order to obtain lawful sustenance, he embarked on a farming venture in partnership with an associate. In a short space of time, due to the great blessing Allah bestowed on his venture, he was incapable of managing it himself, so he appointed an agent in his stead. The Venerable Khwaja's wealth and property increased at such a rate that the accounting office could hardly keep pace with it. On the second occasion, when this poor creature, that's Ali Safi, rubbed his face on the Venerable Khwaja's doorstep, Persian hyperbole, one of his agents informed me that his fields numbered more than 1,300. In those days, he was engaged in the purchase of many additional fields. In just one part of his farmlands, an area called Joibar, which means irrigated, lots of streams, 3,000 workmen were employed. As the Khwaja himself relates, my tithe to the court granary of Sultan Ahmed Mirza amounts to hundreds of thousands of measures per annum. Whenever produce was stored in the Venerable Khwaja's granary, its quantity had always increased by the time it was taken out. As for those who witnessed this supernatural wonder, they totally reinforced their bond of connection with the Venerable Khwaja. When giving his own explanation of this marvel, he would say, "My wealth is for the benefit of the poor. That is why it has this particular quality." From the beginning to the end of his path of perfection, there were no limits to the Venerable Khwaja's help and kindness, bestowed in the highest degree on acquaintances and strangers, on friends and foes alike. His service to one and all, without distinction, became a legend on everybody's tongue. As he himself relates, "I took it upon myself to care for 3 invalids who were lying in Maulana Qutb ad-Din's madrasa in Samarkand. Because their disease was getting worse, they were making their beds filthy. I washed them by hand and changed their underclothes by hand. Since this service of mine was very frequent, their disease infected me too. I also became bedridden. Despite this condition of mine, I continued to fetch a few jugs of water and wash the invalids clean. On the spiritual path of the masters of wisdom, whatever the moment demands, one must act accordingly. Remembrance and vigil, dhikr and muraqabah, can only be practiced when the situation does not call for service to the Muslims. So priority is service. Since a service may be the means of winning the heart, it takes precedence over dhikr and muraqabah. Some consider the performance of nawafil, optional acts of worship, to be more important than service. As a matter of fact, however, the prosperity of the heart is the product of service. If Khwaja Baha'u'ddin Naqshband and his affiliates seem not to have accepted anyone's service, this is simply because of their preference for performing service themselves and practicing modest humility. It is essential to love the doer of good, and the strength of attachment corresponds to the measure of affection. Those committed to this path have sacrificed themselves for the benefit of their fellow creatures, and they are distinguished by the fact that they expect nothing in return. It is not in books that I discovered Sufism, but through serving my fellow creatures. Everyone has a road to follow, and mine has been the road of service. I try to be of service to everyone. Of everyone I have high hopes. Yeah, and then the Rashahat turns to some of his remarks, commenting on some Quranic passages and some hadith. So we might briefly look at these just to indicate. Again, the tariqah is very focused on a due, reverent, contemplative attitude towards scripture, moving from the outward meaning into the living text beneath. And some of the great esoteric tafsirs have come from this tradition. So, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Surah 1, verse 1. This is what he says. Praise, hamd, has its inception and its consummation. Praise has its inception when the servant is thankful for the blessing bestowed upon him, because he realizes that praise increases that blessing. As for the consummation of praise, it comes at the point where thankfulness is the expression of gratitude for strict fulfillment of the duty of servitude, which Allah has imposed upon his servant. Praise also reaches its consummation when the servant realizes that he is but the point of manifestation where Allah, the Exalted, praises himself. As for the servant's perfection, it requires him to recognize his own non-existence and the true existence of Allah, and to acknowledge that neither essence nor attributes nor actions belong to him at all. So this is the sort of Ash'ari or Maturidi understanding that everything is actually the consequence of the direct divine agency, which is not how we see things, but at a non-egotistic higher level of perception, we see that everything is through the divine agency. And then he comments on, وَقَلِيلٌ مِّنْ عِبَادِيَ الشَّكُورِ, few of my servants are thankful. Thankfulness in reality is the servant's recognition in the blessing of the bestower of the blessing. According to the Venerable Imam al-Ghazali, to savour and enjoy the blessing is not at odds with thankfulness. To enjoy the blessing is a means of access to the Lord of Truth. So despite their difficult beginnings, this is not necessarily an ascetical tradition. It's all about the attitude to the things that one possesses. So we might have to fast forward. يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسُ أَنْتُمُ الْفُقَرَاءُ إِلَى اللَّهِ. O mankind, you are the poor or the needy towards God. The human being is needy. Allah knows, through His eternal knowledge, that the human being, by virtue of his human condition, is in the state of needing water, bread, and other means of worldly subsistence. Whatever he needs, therefore, the reality of this need is nothing other than his dependence on God. To emphasize this point, one day the Venerable Khwaja provided those present at his meeting with various warnings and admonitions. He said, "You wander in the streets and stand there to no good purpose. You must at least try and do some useful work, so that your fellow creatures may benefit by you. You must also make the effort required to attain the perception of oneness in multiplicity. This is Wahdat dar Kasrat, the seeing not just the outward manifestation of objects in creation, but seeing the source and the unifying principle which underlies them and gives them sense. Right. And then some of his comments on hadiths. Remember, this is a Naqshbandi lineage, silsila, and therefore traces the reception of its spiritual fragrance back to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. So a text that he likes is one of the last things that the Holy Prophet says when he's too sick to lead the prayer. اليوم تسد كل فرجة إلا فرجة أبي بكر. Today all the doors of the mosque are closed except the door of Abu Bakr, the one through which he comes, because he is to lead the prayer in the absence of the Prophet. And this idea of Abu Bakr as a Siddiq, which is also related to friendship, truthfulness, being real with somebody. Sadiq is a friend, Siddiq is this persistent, holy truthfulness. That this is inseparable from the principle of mahabba, or love. And much of this tradition is about the relationship, the tawajjuh between sheikh and disciple being a relationship of love. In perceiving the perfection, the nobility, the sacrifice of the sheikh, inevitably the murid loves the sheikh, and the sheikh automatically, through his love of everything which he sees as being manifestations of the divine plenitude in every moment, is full of love for creation, despite the difficulty of his personal circumstances. So he links this to this saying towards the end of the seerah, close the doors of the mosque except Abu Bakr's door. And this is what he says. The mosque of the Prophet, Allah give him, bless him and give him peace, has many doors. During the death sickness of Allah's Messenger, when he was in his final moments, he gave orders for all the other doors to be closed and for the door belonging to the Venerable Abu Bakr to be left open. The Khwaja, the masters of truth and reality, have had many things to say on this subject. For instance, the connection of destiny is superior to all other connections. So the day will come when the doors of all other connections are closed and the door of love's link will be left open. Apart from love and affection, there is no connection that leads to Allah and results in attainment of the goal. So it's the Holy Prophet's love for Abu Bakr, his thani ithnain. Remember when the two are hiding from the Quraysh together, make the hijrah together, that's friendship, the love that existed between them, is taken to be a characteristic of, almost seems to be end-time expectation. The day will come when the doors of all other connections are closed. So as the Ummah moves into times when things are harder and austerities become harder to practice, this principle of sort of magnetism, the jadb of love, is going to become more salient in people's spirituality. And you see this as the discourse of our spirituality moves through its literary history. The early period is quite ascetical, hell-fearing, penitential, and then it moves through Rumi and Ibn Arabi to a discourse of love for God and love for creation, love for each other. Not because that's something different, it's just a different emphasis, because this is the process by which people can still relate to the truth. Since the Venerable Abu Bakr, this is Safi here commenting, since the Venerable Abu Bakr is the starting point of the way of the Khwaja, the Masters of Wisdom, love and affection constitute the distinctive feature and emblem of their connection. After explaining this point, Khwaja Ubaidullah went on to say, the whole endeavour is not to lose this connection. So this principle of love is really essential to the entire matter. And there's other very interesting things that pertain really to the specifics of adab in the Khanaqah. the importance that everything in the spiritual space should be from halal origins, and even if somebody comes in wearing something that has not been obtained lawfully, or on which there might be any impurity, then the spiritual atmosphere is dissipated. And he has a number of explanations of that. But time is moving on. Let's just look at some of the other statements. Here's a nice one. One day, when the Venerable Bayezid Bistami, who is in the silsila of the Khwajagan, although he's much earlier, was passing by a certain place, a wet dog came out and shook itself. To keep the spattering drops of water from touching his clothes, the Venerable Bayezid pulled his coattails together and stepped back. The dog acquired the faculty of speech, and it said, "If a single drop from me had touched the hem of your garment, you could have washed it with a small amount of water and restored it to the state of purity. As for the dirt you have dropped into your inner being by folding your coattails and considering yourself pure and superior to me, where can you find enough water to purge that filth away?" It is necessary to lift the burden from one's fellow creatures, and this can only be done through lawful earning. On the path of the masters of wisdom, the hand, dust, is applied to making lawful profit, while the heart is always devoted directly to the beloved. Remember this principle that we noted of dil ba yar, dust ba kar, that the heart is with the beloved, the hand is with the work. And we saw this in the sort of craftsmanship of Maulana Abdallah Ross. Now, this is such a rich book, and there's so much here. Did note some things. I think we've probably got one of these beads of dew quite clear from the Ain al-Hayat sprinklings. Maulana Safi is telling us, and the Ain al-Hayat, the wellspring of life, is dhikr, it's haqiqah itself. It's everything that washes us from the contaminations of the ego. This is classic spirituality. The ego, nafs, self, is a contamination that actually, despite all of its promises, obstructs our happiness. By transcending it, by drawing the dagger of mujahada, as Imam Junaid says, trying to stab it recurrently in all of those moments where it's ego against service, recurrently we become habituated to something else and become different human beings and start to function as human beings are supposed to, as rememberers. In his early life as a small child, Khwaja Ubaidullah Ahrar just assumed, of course, everybody sees reality and remembers God. The world is calling out with his name, and it was hard for him to understand that there'd be some people who are not in that condition. But it's the ego that gets in our way. So let's just close by reading just the story of his demise. We've only done about 5% of the book. According to the author of the Rashahat, who was there, Safi, when this poor creature obtained the honor for the second time of encountering the Venerable Khwaja, it was the 24th day of the month Rabi al-Akhir in the year AH 893, 1488. When I was in his company, he made his age known, saying, "After 3 years and 4 months, my age will be 90. In the month of Muharram, he fell sick with the illness that would transport him to the realm of perpetuity. Since he survived until Rabi al-Awwal of that same year, it can be reckoned that he had reached the age of 89. On Wednesday, the 20th of Muharram, the Venerable Khwaja left his place in Kafshir and set out on the road to the village of Kamangaran. Along the way, he alighted to spend the night in Qujanan. Then on the Thursday morning, he took the highway in the direction of Kamangaran. He was so weak that he could not pass beyond the town, so he spent that night there too. On the Friday morning, he again attempted to travel. He made frequent stops along the road and tried to catch some rest. On the Saturday night, at the time of the evening prayer, he finally reached Kamangaran, where he stayed for 7 days, still able to stand in spite of his weakness. On the 7th day, a Friday, his infirmity became intense and he collapsed into bed. Though confined to his bed, he duly performed his ritual prayers for 3 months, and he was guilty of no omission, despite the fact that he could not stand on his feet. The month of Rabi al-Awwal finally arrived. His illness had reached its ultimate stage. One evening, he asked, "Has the evening prayer, Maghrib, been announced?" "Yes," we replied, "it has been announced." Only by nods and signs could he perform that day's evening prayer. Shortly after the prayer, he suddenly stopped breathing and attained to the mercy of the Lord of Truth. But there's more information about the last hours of Sheikh Ubaidullah Ahrar. So how do we engage with this? Somebody born and raised and disciplined at an age in which there were great teachers and great possibilities for stepping outside tedious, dusty, soul-contaminating worldliness into a space where one could clearly see what our task is, which, as the Naqshbandi masters say, is hosh dardam, awareness with every breath. Nowadays, in a new agey way, we might say mindfulness, but this is the Naqshbandi way. Hosh dardam, attentiveness with every breath. In other words, every moment, be aware of the unique brilliance and divine irreplaceability of the disposition of creation in that second, even if you're just putting a splint on the paw of a dog in the street. Be aware of the irreplaceable excellence and ihsan of that moment. Don't just space out and let it pass away, because it is what it is. But also be aware of the possibilities for service. And service in this way takes priority over dhikr. Naqshbandis do a lot of dhikr, mostly the silent dhikr, but service is their way, as we've seen eminently in the life of the great Khwaja and the life of al-marhum Abdal Ross. But through not ego, but what they call nazar bar qadam. Sheikh Abdullah in particular followed this principle. Nazar bar qadam, the second of their principles, means to look at your feet, to look down, not to kind of ostentatiously check your tie in front of the microphone and to look, sort of the Boris Johnson thing, look at me. It doesn't matter what I'm going to say, I've got no idea, but here I am. Just ego in all of its, at best, mediocrity. But no, the real one is not the one who's looking to the cameras, but the one who is looking down. So humility is such an essential principle. Safar dar vatan, the journey to the homeland. We're all heading back to the ma'ab, back to the place of return, the ma'ad. In our tradition, in the Quran, often what is after death is referred to as the place of return. We speak of the ma'ad. So safar dar vatan is a reality. We have to be aware that that's the journey that we're taking. You're on a plane to Dusseldorf or something, but much more certainly than that, you're on the journey to the next world. The plane can be diverted, or there can be a catering strike or something, and who knows. But this journey, the destination, is one that you will definitely reach, and remembering that is indispensable. Khalvat dar anjuman is another of their principles, the Khwajagan. Solitude in the crowd. In other words, when with others, you don't have to step outside their company, but do not be swept up by the kind of herd instinct of the crowd, by the kind of endorphin-inducing mass emotion or thoughtlessness of a party culture or a football-supporting culture, whatever else it might be. Be alone in that crowd, because not because of your awareness of superiority, but because of your awareness that you have important things to do at that time. So that's khalwat dar anjuman. And the other of ones of the 8 principles that we need to recall and reflect on how they are articulated in the lives of people like Khwaja Ubaidullah Yad kard, remember, just means dhikr, make the remembrance. Whatever the circumstance, even if it seems to be khidmat rather than you doing your wazifa or your khatam, remembrance. Khidmah is not an alternative to remembering God, it is an opportunity to remember Him. That's important for those who are in modern high-pressure careers, I think, where they think, I don't really have time for God at work because there's so much in my in-tray. You have to think carefully about your daily life and figure out how you can use its features, its rhythms, as a means for service, and as a means for service, also as a means for remembrance. Even if the service is just so you can put food on your family's table at the end of the day, that also is a noble service and should not be underestimated, but try and find ways of sanctifying even the profane things that you do. Bazgarad, restraining your thoughts. Be conscious of the jumping of the monkey thoughts and the random stream of consciousness in the head, which never takes you anywhere particularly helpful. Only disciplined thinking is going to improve you and improve your life. So that inward restraint is important, which takes them on to what they call nigah dasht, which is developing techniques for scrutinizing the flow of consciousness in your mind, so that you are making use of every moment. This khosh dardam, how can you be attentive in every breath? Only through some kind of inward discipline, not through spacing out. The strange things that the brain does when watching television, and the kind of consciousness is who knows where. One is comatose or almost dead. No, what is required is to be aware of the tendency of the thoughts to stray, which is one of the advantages of religious duty. You know, if you are used to disciplining your thoughts during your 5 daily namaz prayers, that is going to be a helpful exercise that will assist you in being a disciplined person at other times as well, because it's the same kind of muscular aspect of the brain and your consciousness that's being developed. Get into the habit of resisting wool gathering, spacing out, and you will find everything else comes more easily for you in your life. And then yad dasht, concentrate on God. The dhikr is not just subhanallah, subhanallah and certain qualities, but focus on the divine reality as al-qarib, the near, the only true reality. Everything else is just kind of contingently or provisionally real, but the absolute haqq is the Lord, tabaraka wa ta'ala, and engrave that upon the heart, which is really the meaning of Naqshband. The divine name is engraved upon the heart. Be aware of that. What does the heart say? The moment the fetus's heart starts to beat, which is said to be the time of the ensoulment of the spirit, Allah, Allah, Allah. Most of the time we're not listening. Allah is patient with us. But to focus on that, to realize that the divine name is inscribed upon our hearts, Naqshband, will enable us to open our eyes and start to become living human beings rather than just consumers on autopilot until we end up drugged in some retirement home. May Allah save us all from that prospect and make us people who benefit from the richness and the irreplaceability and the giftedness of every moment, inshallah, with His help, because without His help we can do nothing at all. Barakallahu feekum wal afu minkum. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Cambridge Muslim College, training the next generation of Muslim thinkers.